Greetings and good evening. My name is Christina Turner, and I am the Director of Education and Public Programs at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. I am so grateful to be welcoming everyone for tonight's Baja program, Calling Out the Calling in Culture with Loretta J. Ross. This program is both a timely conversation and a signifier of all the hard work the Lyceum Committee continues to do to bring us relevant and meaningful speakers. It also marks the beginning of the Lyceum and New Bedford Whaling Museum partnership, furthering the museum's commitment to delivering programs that create space for public learning, conversation, and community building. I look forward to all the ways that the museum and the Lyceum Committee will continue to work together to bring you these significant and necessary programming. With that said, please join me in welcoming Patty Rigo, Lyceum Committee member and Director of Viva Fall River.
Good evening, and on behalf of the New Bedford Lyceum and its partner organizations, I thank you for joining us. The New Bedford Lyceum was originally established in 1828 and was the nexus of community life, both intellectually and culturally in 19th century New Bedford. Its programming was as broad as it was substantial, tackling the most profound topics and social challenges of the day and presenting some of the leading minds of the nation, such as Frederick Douglass, Stephen Foster, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Charles Dickens, and Abraham Lincoln, among others. In 2016, Mayor John Mitchell invited civic leaders to establish a forum where nationally recognized speakers would present on a variety of topics. Thus, the New Bedford Lyceum was reborn, reviving a 19th century tradition that established New Bedford as a national intellectual leader. Although the topics may be different in some ways, today's Lyceum stayed true to the original intent to bring distinguished speakers to the region to open minds and inspire good citizenship through community discourse and debate, encouraging civic dialogue, promoting diversity, and encouraging community engagement. I am absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome this evening's distinguished speaker, feminist, activist, public intellectual, author, and professor Loretta J. Ross. Professor Ross is widely known for her activism in support of reproductive justice and has co-written 3 books on the topic. She has 45 years of experience in intersectional social movement building, ranging from the National Anti-Klan Network to co-founding Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. She is currently a visiting professor at Smith College in the program for study of gender, where she teaches a course on white supremacy, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture. She authored a book that's coming out this fall, Calling in the Calling Out Culture, and also hosts her own podcast, Dread Feminist, with Loretta J. Ross. There's so much more that I could say about Professor Ross, but I think the best way to get to know her is to listen to her speak and hear what she has to say, and that is precisely what we're here to do this evening. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Loretta J. Ross to our South Coast community. Professor Ross.
Thank you for that warm welcome, and it's such an honor to be able to follow such a wonderful tradition of speakers. I am impressed by the list of people who've spoken at the Lyceum, and I just hope that I can do justice to that legacy. A few years ago, approximately 6 years ago, I suddenly noticed how mean people were being to each other on social media. And at that time, I had been doing human rights and social justice work for over 45 years. So I thought that I had something to contribute to that conversation to help us switch from calling each other out so much into calling each other in. I was the director of the first rape crisis center in this country. And while I was in that position, I taught Black feminist theory to Black men who had been incarcerated for raping and murdering women. And I have to say that as a rape survivor, I'd never thought that I would be offering anything, but particularly Black feminist education to men who had raped and murdered Black women. And then 20 years later, I found myself at the National Anti-Klan Network, working with the very famous Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was an aide to Dr. Martin Luther King. And one thing Reverend Vivian had said that is when you ask people to give up hate, and that led me into working with Leonard Zeskin and participating in the deprogramming of people who've been in the white supremacist movement, like the KKK and the neo-Nazi movement and the militias. And I found within myself a compassion for the most undeserving people. So when I heard about the call out culture that young people had named, I thought I could bring forward that body of experience and talk about how we need to actually live up to the saying that Reverend Joseph Lowery used to say in the civil rights movement all the time. And that's, let us learn how to turn to each other instead of on each other. This was something that was frequently said in the civil rights movement, and I want to bring it forth for the 21st century human rights movement, because I believe that calling in practices will be as important to the human rights movement in the 21st century as nonviolence was to the civil rights movement in the 20th century. So without further ado, let me start screen sharing and let's go through my PowerPoint. I am a Texan, a Southern, and I generally speak very slow, but when you have a lot of information to portray very quickly, sometimes you can garble your words, so that I hope that you're able to understand me. Because English is only my second language to begin with, and I'm not really good at it. Let me get this out of my way and find out why my slideshow is not showing up. Okay, thank you. Hopefully y'all can see that. Can I get a yes or an amen?
We see it.
Okay, then, thank you. I am a member of the human rights movement. As I said earlier, I believe that human rights is the pathway forward as we deal with this very troubling modern world that we're embedded in. As a matter of fact, I believe that human rights is that connective tissue that we all should be using as our pathway forward. And I'm glad that y'all mentioned Frederick Douglass in the opening, describing the history of your institution, because Frederick Douglass in 1858 used the phrase human rights to protest the lynching of a Black man in New York City. And so for several hundred years, Black people in this country have been demanding that we build a human rights movement. And of course, 90 years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was developed by the United Nations under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt. And that is, as I say, is the vision for what we're fighting for, because we can't only be defined by what we're fighting against. As a feminist, I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, but I also care about racial justice. So I'm part of the civil rights wing of the human rights movement, and I'm disabled, so I'm part of the disability rights wing of the human rights movement. I'm just using this graphic to say that we are all each other's allies, no matter what we focus on. And obviously, I don't have enough arrows to put all the issues up there that we all care about. But if we understand that we're all in the same movement, working on different things, then we should also understand that it's very important for us not to create contradictions for each other in doing our human rights work. In other words, I can't do women's rights work in a way that is racist, or I can't work for trans rights in a way that is misogynist, or for civil rights in a way that is homophobic without causing contradictions for my own movement. And that's why I'm so passionate about talking to people about calling in the calling out culture, because I think we spend too much time attacking each other than keeping focus on the forces that would deny us our human rights. I want to quote famed activist Grace Lee Boggs, who unfortunately died in 2015. You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. And this is our responsibility today. Some people say that the fragility of our democracy bespeaks that we're in a new civil war. In fact, I believe it's the same old civil war that has not yet been resolved, and that insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6th proved the fact that we have not resolved that fundamental question about the United States, whether it will be a democracy or whether it will continue its legacy from slavery, where only certain people have full civil and human rights, and the rest of the people are to be seen as subordinated. Because the protesters at the US Capitol on January 6th, they weren't protesting because white men were getting killed, like the Black Lives Matter movement does. They weren't protesting because white votes weren't being counted. They were protesting because Black votes were being counted. And they did not see that as legitimate. They do not see the Black voters who elected Joe Biden as legitimate representatives and members of this American democracy. And that's why I consider that question still unresolved. And unfortunately, this was very predictable. Ulysses S. Grant, who was elected president 4 years after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, faced many insurrections by Confederates from the South. And he predicted that if we're to have another civil war, I predict that the dividing line will not be Mason and Dixon's, but between patriotism and intelligence on the one side and superstition, ambition, and ignorance on the other. That prophecy, unfortunately, has come true because we are fighting for the soul of our country, trying to use facts, evidence, truth, intelligence as our patriotic duty to live up to the promise of America. And our foes are choosing to use superstition, naked, raw ambition, and manipulation of ignorant people on the other side. So it's the same old civil war. And I would argue that if we had held those traitors accountable in 1865, we would not have seen the Confederate flag in the US Capitol in 2021. But my point is that we cannot take on these forces of authoritarianism, what I would call neo-fascist forces, who believe in the ideology of white supremacy, if we remain the divided and the conquered, because as Lincoln said, a country divided cannot stand. And so to that end, I've been teaching about calling in the calling out culture. And I want to start by describing the continuum of calling out. I will be describing in more detail what is calling out, but basically it's publicly shaming people for things that they believe or things that they've said or even how they look or what their identity is, simply because you don't agree with them. And the words that are working hardest in that sentence are publicly shaming people, because obviously you got to offer a private correction if you didn't want to publicly call them out. There is an intermediate step called calling on. Sonia Renee Taylor is the creator of this concept, where she talks about why she is not ready to make an investment in somebody else's growth, which is what calling out attempts to do to achieve accountability, nor is she willing to offer them the benefit of the doubt yet, which is what calling in requires. Her calling on intermediate step is basically to look the person straight in the eye and simply say, I beg your pardon, and let that lay there for a minute while the person reviews in their own heads the words that just came out of their mouths. And so sometimes they'll back up and try it again. And depending on what their response is, that's when Sonia says she'll decide whether to call them out or call them in. Because the real question isn't whether people make mistakes. That's pretty predictable and inevitable. The real question is whether they're ready to be accountable for the mistakes that they make. So when someone makes a mistake and then they try to deny that the mistake has happened, or that the mistake that they made has caused harm to somebody, and they don't want to apologize for the mistake, then that increases the chances that that person will be called out. But if that same person makes a mistake, acknowledges the harm that they made through that mistake, offers to repair the damage from that mistake, and offers a sincere and effective apology, the probability is that that person will be called in. And calling in, of course, is the desire to hold people accountable for the harm that they do, the possible mistakes that they made, but your principal weapons are not blaming, shaming, and punishment like in calling out, but in fact, respect, love, and grace, because you're going to act like you're holding somebody else's heart in your hand and you just don't want to squeeze it too tight. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about, mostly calling out and calling in. So as I said, calling out is being very critical of other people's social justice practices, which ironically, the same people who offer the most pungent criticism of what everybody else is doing rarely are self-critical of their own practices because they are fundamentally convinced that they're doing it right and everyone else they're criticizing is doing it wrong. And this requires them weaponizing what limited knowledge they have as a weapon against each other. And knowledge is the greatest privilege in the world, and learning to use that responsibly seems to be difficult for some people. But I would argue that the extent to which you feel you need to call somebody out is the extent to which you've proven that you're not woke enough, because you're trying to banish people thinking that they're not woke enough, when in fact, that is going to backlash on you by proving that you're not woke enough, so that you think that we're in a woke competition and that you're supposed to be competing with the very people that you're supposed to be collaborating with. And calling out is also often used by some people to boost their ego or their standing in community, or maybe to even find out other people who share their point of view. And they mistakenly believe that the way that you do human rights work is to have perfect alignment of political opinions. Our opinions must be pure. And if they're not pure, then we need to shame and bully people who do not share our perfectly aligned opinions, because obviously using that binary, that false binary of right and wrong, we're right and they're wrong. Unfortunately, this whole debate on calling out and cancel culture, as it's sometimes called. I mean, the difference between a call out is that you publicly criticize somebody, but it also can escalate to cancellation, where you're trying to get somebody fired from their job or deplatformed or just excised from public life. And so calling in, calling out, and cancellation are along that same continuum I spoke about earlier. But Ta-Nehisi Coates points out that there's something particularly ironic by the way that the right wing has suddenly seized upon the idea that they're the principal victims of the call out cancel culture. And he writes that any sober assessment of this history must conclude that the present objections to cancel culture are not so much concerned with the weapon as the kind of people who now seek to wield it. Until recently, cancellation flowed exclusively downward from the powerful to the powerless. But now, in this era of fallen gatekeepers, where anyone with a Twitter handle or a Facebook account can be a publisher, banishment has been ostensibly democratized. And so, what we have at this particular political moment is anger by the people who previously had a monopoly on the power of calling out and canceling people, where in fact the fact that anybody with access to the internet can reverse things and call people out is very frustrating for those who think that they're the only ones who should be citizens of the United States. They're the only ones that should have voting rights in the United States. They're the only ones that should decide our public policy. And they're the only ones that should decide whether or not we have a social contract around healthcare and education and all the other issues that make a civil society possible. And they do not like sharing democracy. They have basically indicated that if they cannot permanently and singularly control democracy, they would rather destroy it. Again, 1861 comes to mind. Now, there are appropriate uses of call out. I think that you can use call outs very effectively when you're looking at power disparities among people, when people who are abusing their power over other people are inaccessible and are immune to being called in when you try to privately work with them. But sometimes when you're trying to privately hold people accountable, they end up actually increasing the harm that they commit, because sometimes you just have to shame people publicly to get them to check themselves. Calling out can also be used to help people who are experiencing similar harm and to build community with those people and spread information to people who are experiencing invisible or unmarked structures of privileges that cause harm, and also whose voices have been historically silenced. And certainly calling out is very cathartic because it allows people to release pent up outrage. And sometimes public shaming does help. But mostly, calling out is not effective, because you can imagine that if you're a human being and you've made a mistake, and if you know that if you confess to your mistake, that someone is not only going to call you out, but that a bully mob is going to be summoned to descend on you like a pack of wolves, why would you walk into that field of fire admitting that you've done anything wrong? And so, ironically, calling out decreases the likelihood of accountability instead of increasing the likelihood of accountability. But Natalie Wynn is a YouTuber with a podcast, I guess it's called, or YouTube video called Contrapoints. And she writes about how calling out gets magnified into a cancel culture, because it starts off with the presumption of guilt, not a presumption of innocence. And so, for instance, let's say that you're in a meeting with somebody and somebody named Joe says something that one person interprets as being racist. Well, the minute that person says, well, Joe says something is racist, there's going to be a group of people who are going to presume Joe is guilty, take the word of the person who called Joe's comment racist, and not even bother to investigate whether or not what Joe said actually was racist, or whether or not Joe is actually guilty of what is said he's accused of having said. And this assertion that Joe has said something racist is so quickly abstracted that next thing it becomes an essentialized feature of Joe's moral character. So it goes from Joe said something that was racist to Joe is a racist. And the people who make that assertion or that claim assume a pseudo-moralistic stand or a pseudo-intellectual stand. I know what is racist. I know what is right. And Joe is a racist. They usually opine very loudly and very affirmatively so that Joe is caught in a bind because, again, there has been no investigation of whether Joe actually said that thing, whether it was actually racist, and what Joe was actually thinking, because nobody stopped and said, Joe, what are you actually saying now? Instead, they made some assumptions about Joe. And it's just that system of false binaries, right, wrong, straight, gay, good, evil, that lends itself to magnification of the call out culture with a certain amount of self-righteousness. And poor Joe, he's now run into the snare of unforgivability and unforgettability. Because if Joe finally hears what's being said about him and tries to make amends, tries to offer an apology, well, even the fact that he's trying to make an apology will be read as insincere. But Joe says, let's say Joe says, I don't think what I said was really racist. So I'm not going to apologize. By making that claim, then Joe is going to be seen as trying to evade accountability. And so Joe is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. That's a very Kafkaesque kind of trap that he's in. And because it happened to him, not only is what he's alleged to have done unforgivable, but it's also unforgettable. So that this moniker of racist will be permanently attached to Joe so securely that anybody who tries to come to poor Joe's defense or tries to say, okay, let's try to give Joe the benefit of the doubt, or we should go talk to Joe. By the way, you're now contaminated and you must be a racist too, because you're trying to defend a racist. And we're going to see you as infectious and give you the same punishment and exile that Joe deserves. And so that is what frightens a lot of people to become the bully mob, because they don't want to get treated the same way that Joe is treated. And their fear causes them to pile on poor Joe without doing any investigation, without having any due process, without a presumption of innocence, because they want to virtue signal that they're on the right side. And that's how call-in culture go with the speed of light from an awkward statement to a total character condemnation. Now, as I said, the people on the right are bitterly criticizing the call out or the council culture. And of course, in 2020, they decided at the Republican National Convention that it was going to be a top priority, and basically said that anytime anybody offers a Republican a critique, that person is trying to cancel or censor us. And they call political correctness, sorry for the typo, a new witch hunt, the new McCarthyism, because they have no sense of irony, and that is threatening free speech by conservatives in general and Trump supporters in particular. And they like to make the claim that within the academy, conservatives are the ones under attack by liberals. And of course, all of this is being orchestrated and funded by the Koch brothers, who have congregated a lot of right-wing foundation and donor money from the Olin Foundation and Scaife Foundation as well into the American Legislative Exchange Council, that then presents all of these model bills and these model strategies as a way of attacking the politics of liberals and Democrats in America, again, around securing permanent freedom. If you have not read Nancy MacLean's book, which just quickly went out of my mind, Democracy in Chains, I totally recommend that that's one of the books that you read to find out the roots of this attack on democracy that was initiated in 1954 by conservatives in response to the Brown v. Board of Education decision desegregating public education. But they like to claim that people on the left are using wokeness because we're too coddled, we're too sensitive, we're snowflakes that can't stand a healthy debate on our ideas, and we're intolerant of their ideas. And in fact, you should ignore all the historical, hierarchical, and power structures that are taking place within our society, past and present, because everyone, by the way, should have the right to say whatever they want to say without any consequences, because it's a matter of free speech. And so people should not be punished in their opinion for making sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, or xenophobic comments simply because the people who disagree with what they're saying are just too thin-skinned. And they make the false claim that white men, like they did just the other night on Fox News, that white heterosexual men are the principal victims of this call out cancel culture, but all conservatives are vulnerable to the outrage of the leftist mobs. And really, they're claiming that they should have the freedom to discriminate because that is an aspect of their religious freedom, and particularly the freedom to discriminate against LGBTQ people. And they claim that their particular brand of Christianity is under attack, and that leftists are unfairly using call outs to criticize US corporations or US allies or corporate, other human rights violators that apparently we just don't like what they're saying. Now, of course, people on the left have their own opinion about the call out cancel culture. We correctly point out that the whole call out cancel culture was totally exemplified by the McCarthy anti-communist persecutions that began in the late 1940s that accused hundreds of Americans of being communist or communist sympathizers. And these accusations weren't just idle gossip over the internet. It cost people their jobs, their families, and sometimes their lives. And that these criticisms just weren't people mumbling about each other, but also targeted leftist professors in the academy, beginning with Angela Davis getting fired in 1970. And there's a continuing campaign to rid liberal universities of professors who speak up around offering a critique of Israel, or fired for talking about white supremacy or white genocide, or being accused of anti-white bigotry. And Lisa Durden, as you can see on the page, was fired simply for saying on Fox News that Black Lives Matter. And of course, we have the culture wars where movies like The Passion of Christ or The Chronicles of Narnia or even Harry Potter gets targeted by Christian nationalists for cancellation. And this extends to music like rock and roll and rap music, where people like NWA, which is a rap group, was threatened with imprisonment for lyrics that the right wing didn't like. But they claim they're the defenders of free speech, but they want to put people in jail for the speech that they don't like that people use that criticizes them. And the left is convinced, like most of the human rights movement, that public shaming is a valuable tactic of the human rights movement because it's the best way to reach inaccessible people who are violating human rights. We have created within the human rights movement a framework called democratic speech environment that centers justice-seeking speech, not just recognizing that people on the right who want to have consequence-free free speech are not the ones that are using their speech responsibly, because they're using it, in fact, to cause harm to people, because words do have the power to wound and to reinforce social inequalities. And we, of course, recognize that the call-outs are only criticized by the right when the previous victims of oppression start speaking up. And these attacks on political correctness have been a way to manipulate and animate a white grievance analysis or perception amongst a base that's fearful of losing a monopoly on power in our society and to maintain an unjust hierarchy. And people are frequently canceled who speak up on certain issues like supporting Palestinians or even criticizing Trump family members. So the left has a different opinion about the call out house cancel culture than the right. But even as I'm only focusing on the left, I want to talk about the toxicity of this culture because it paradoxically replicates the carceral system of punishment, the prison industrial complex, that we've already said that we want to abolish or deconstruct. So it's a master's tool thing, like Audre Lorde says. How can we use the tactics of the prison industrial complex to actually handle accountability within our own movement? And the way, when we choose to do it that way, it really discourages others from wanting to work with us because we're a bunch of censorious Debbie Downers. And nobody who wants to see any joy in life wants to join a very judgmental mob for fear that they'll be the next one called on to or called out and be punished for what they believe or think. And in fact, instead of building a movement where people feel enthusiasm and joy for writing, for working on the right side of history, we make people fearful that they can't even speak up and tell the truth for fear that we will gaslight them and not believe that their truth is as valid as anybody else's truth, because it drives people away from the movement. And as I said earlier, it really disguises the privilege we have while weaponizing language against others, because it makes accountability so difficult that it does increase harm rather than healing. And instead of bringing people together, the whole call out culture isolates them rather than unifies us. And then probably most dangerous, it creates a culture of cynicism and hopelessness where people don't believe that we will ever win against the forces of hate and despair because we so closely resemble the forces of hate and despair. And at this point, I want to talk about the difference between blame versus responsibility, because there's actually no one alive who has created this system of white supremacy that we're in, unless you're Methuselah or something. But we all have a responsibility for ending it. Isabel Wilkerson, in her book Caste, talks about the shaky foundation of a house that you just purchased. And if you're the owner of that house, you can't be blamed for the fact that that foundation is faulty and should have been repaired a long time ago, but you are responsible for fixing it. So that's the difference between blame and responsibility. You may not have created the problem, but we all share responsibility for fixing it. And if you're that homeowner, you enjoy the privilege of living in that house. And with that privilege comes the responsibility for fixing what is wrong with that house. And for us who have the privilege of you living in the United States, we have a responsibility for fixing it. And so this starts by understanding our circles of influence, or I call it sometimes my don't waste your time strategy. I suspect that most of us who are on this webinar are what I call 90%ers, people who have a high degree of political unity with each other. And you can tell this not because we're a large percentage of the population, meaning 90%, but that we have this high degree of unity because we know our own buzzwords like racism, capitalism, patriarchy, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, and things. And we speak these words to each other, and we sharply criticize people who don't know these words, because our in-group lexicon is one of the ways that we define who's the in-group of the 90%ers. The biggest mistake we make, though, as 90%ers is that we put too much pressure on each other to become 100%ers. And that is a mistaken strategy, because we are supposed to have some disagreements with each other. We're only human. And if we were to be 100%ers, we'd actually be clones of each other. Or another way that you can put it is that when many different people move in a move in the same direction, but they have different ideas, that's a movement. But when many different people use one idea to move in the same direction, that's a cult. And we are not building a human rights cult. We're supposed to enjoy having a diversity of opinions and perspectives and not put pressure on each other using cult building tactics to try to enforce a rigid dogma, a doctrinaire groupthink of being, way of being that is basically intolerant and usually severely underdeveloped as an analysis. Surrounding us are the 75 percenters. These are the people who don't use our in-group language, but they share a worldview that is overlaps with ours quite a bit, and in many ways they share our values. So for me as a feminist who believes in abortion rights, for example, a 75 percenter for me would be the Girl Scouts. While they may not be leading the troop to defend an abortion clinic like I wish they would, they still believe in women and girls empowerment. And I certainly enjoy that agenda and share that agenda with them. And it would be a strategic mistake for me to try to take them from being 75% in agreement with me and try to turn them into 90 percenters or 100 percenters when they can stay exactly where they are if they agree to work with me. And that's really, it's not about getting people to agree with you, it's getting people to agree to be with you. That's so important. Outside of them are the 50 percenters. These would be people like my parents. Now, my parents were very conservative. My father was a military veteran after spending almost a lifetime in the military. My mother was a Southern evangelical Christian woman. And they didn't understand my radical politics at all. But one of the things that they did believe in was service to the community. For example, as a Girl Scout, one of the things we had to do was fix food every weekend for homeless people. And so my mother understood her service, her social obligation as feeding the hungry, while my understanding of my mother's value is asking why they're hungry in the first place. And so I share with my parents their values, even if they express them in a different way. Now, the reason I identify them as 50 percenters is that they're so carefully poised in the middle that they could go to the right or the left. Because if I fail to create a movement where my parents can be involved in and resonate with the values that they have that I share, the chances are that they will be organized instead to go to the right by the 25 percenters. These are people who are hyped up on a false patriotism because they don't actually believe in democracy and the Constitution. They just want to pimp it and pretend that everybody who doesn't believe in them are in fact not patriotic. These would be the people who are basically Trump supporters who still believe that the election was stolen, and they are, are falling into the QAnon fantasy holes. But I have to honestly say they're pretty effective at persuading the 50 percenters who are teetering on the brink of going right or left to begin to be with them. And outside of them are the 0 percenters. I call them not zeros because I'm talking about their moral character, but there's so little ideological overlap between them and me that we don't have any common ground. I'm not even sure we agree on gravity working, because they define freedom as the freedom not to wear a mask, and I define freedom as the freedom to be away from anybody who won't wear a mask. And so we just have such radically different worldviews. Our strategic mistake is that we fail to see ourselves as 90 percenters who can best influence the 75 percenters who can best influence the 50, and so on. Instead, we try to leap over all those other areas and think that we're going to flip a Klansman or flip a Trump supporter, and they're in our families, and we understand that. I actually teach a class online every Tuesday night for the next Tuesday nights about techniques for talking to Trump supporters or people in your family. And you can find out about it on my website, lorettajross.com. Each class is only $5. So for $10, you can get the techniques for talking to your family. But anyway, most of us think that we're just going to step over all these other layers and convince Trump supporters or even outright neo-fascists to support us. The problem is with that flawed strategy is that all the influence has been going the wrong way for the last 50 years. And so that the ideas that used to be on the margins of our society, like banning immigrants or repealing all the civil rights legislation or attacking voting rights, have now marched into the mainstream of public policy, while we arrogantly stay in our 90% bubble trying to call everybody out. And so if we're going to work from this 90% to this 50% circle of influence, we've got to stop overstating our harm. We've got to take the suffering of those 75 and 50%ers seriously. Many times you have to go underneath their words to ask why tell me more with our calling on strategy. We have to challenge those narratives that are only viewed through a victim or trauma lens, even our own, because we like to think of ourselves as being permanently victimized by people who don't agree with us. Sometimes you can offer facts about what's going on in the world and they'll be open to them. But this can only be effective if you normalize a calling in culture to avoid arousing their defensiveness. Because the minute you start calling them names, you shut off their hearing. And again, we have to make it joyful and fun to be on the right side of history and to revel in facts and evidence, not whip people up with them. And I find that if we can use experiences that resonate with their lived experiences, this can really reinforce their positive values, particularly if we avoid the name calling. So if we're going to rethink calling out, we've got to avoid that us versus them mentality, focus on why we want to call people in, make sure we're not sabotaging our own strategy or outcomes with a ill-timed call out, and that we must collaborate with people by avoiding shame and ousting as punishment and valuing our opportunities to build relationships with others to build power together. So calling in is actually learning a growth mindset. Calling in is basically a call out done with love. You're still working to achieve accountability, but you're going to do so by giving others the benefit of the doubt. You're not going to assume that the words that came out of their mouth is a full representation of who they are and what they think. You're going to use tactics like, can you tell me more? Or I don't think that I heard or understood you well. Can we talk some more? To actually explore who that person is and what they are actually believing in and working on. And we need to acknowledge that people are supposed to have diverse opinions on different things. Even if they're on the same team, you're going to have people in different roles on that same team. And you have to always remember the broader context, because too often people are called out for things they've done in their distant past that now get brought forward and get weaponized against them in this gotcha moment. The same way that young Black editor at Teen Vogue had an ill thought out tweet from 10 years ago when she was 17, weaponized against her when she was 27 and caused her to basically get fired for Teen Vogue. And ironically, the young woman who found and unearthed that tweet on the fired editor ended up having had committed the same kinds of badly thought out tweets herself. And so we're finding that calling out is really an ineffective way to do righteous work. And that's why our active, loving listening practices matter so much. And we need to be grateful for the opportunity to learn together. So if you want to call people in, you have to first analyze why you want to do it. How do you feel? Are you in a sufficiently healed enough place to offer grace, love, and respect to somebody you don't agree with? Because if you're still bleeding from the wounds of oppression yourself and you try to call somebody in, you're just going to bleed all over them. And as a matter of fact, you're going to sabotage the calling in because you have not yet done your own healing, and you're most likely going to leave with anger, punishment, and like I said, the PIC, the prison industrial complex tactics. You have to also accept that you don't have the power to change other people, but you can offer love and respect. And quite often, even as you make the offer to other people, they're not going to have an instant epiphany and suddenly say, oh, I see the light now, and, give you that ego boost. As a matter of fact, when you make the offer, the chances are they're going to say, well, yeah, I don't agree with you, and walk away. And so they may have a change of heart or epiphany long after you're gone. And so just acknowledge that you don't have the magic power to change somebody just because you want to. If we had that magic power, couples wouldn't fight, families wouldn't fight, co-workers wouldn't fight, etc. And we need to ask ourselves, what is preventing you from speaking up despite your fear? Because we're all afraid who do this work. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing the right thing anyway, even if you are afraid. And the essence of calling out is the fact that most of us cannot forgive ourselves for the mistakes that we've made. And that means we can't forgive others. So in my lectures online, I always ask people to go back to their childhood and remember how their mistakes were handled when they were children. And if they were punished and shamed for making a mistake, there's a great likelihood that they think that they should punish and shame other people for making mistakes. But if when you were a child and your mistakes were seen as learning opportunities and you were forgiven for them instead of being shamed for them, chances are you're going to be predisposed to forgive others. And so if you're going to call people in, you got to pay attention to power differentials. Only do so if you can demonstrate genuine respect and caring for the other person, even if you disagree with them. That also depends on your relationship to them, whether or not they're a casual stranger over the internet or someone in your family. A peer-to-peer calling in works best, and there is a difference between social media calling in and in person. And sometimes you can avoid call outs by calling in. And I'll let this be my last slide, because you really need to think through the decision to declare war on someone's life or character. And never make choices that you can't look in the eye without shame. Don't go littering your own life with regrets. That's not helpful. And we actually do control our own opinion of ourselves when we choose honesty over deception and compassion over shaming. I find that people who express regrets mostly express regrets for the things they didn't do versus the things they did do. Their failure to speak up when they saw something that was wrong or unjust, those kinds of things. And because the relationship that most matters is the one with our own integrity. Our reputation is what other people think that they know about us, but our integrity is what we know about ourselves. So we need to examine our motives, understand the concept of servant leadership, and you can read about that in many different books, and understand that having high principles and living up to them is hard work, but that doesn't mean we get to weaponize them and punish other people for that. And when we work to change the world by using calling in practices, we really enlarge the possibilities of what the social justice movement can achieve, because we center our interdependence, our ethics, and our empathy, because our radical love can bridge differences of identity and ideology. So I'm a little over time, so I'm gonna stop this share and leave time for Q&A. And I'm going to look in the chat to see if there are questions here.
I can look for you actually, Professor Ross. Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. We did get one question early on. Is there a risk when we calling out culture, that we participate in a conservative dismissal and weaponizing of young people's willingness to raise their voices against injustice?
Well, one thing I know after studying the fascist movement for a long, long time, they do what they do because of who they are, not because of what we do. They're going to be mean. They're going to use violence as their currency. They're going to be hypocrites because that's who they are. So I never counsel us to moderate our base our strategies based on what we think the opponents are going to do, because that's who they are. And we don't have a lot of control over them being who they are. So I don't think that we risk the conservatives saying, I told you so, when we use honesty, integrity, and facts to state our position and do so with love and respect. First of all, we'll be speaking in a register that they don't understand. And secondly, the reason they have to lie and manipulate is because their truths don't serve them very well. If they told the truth, they would have no followers. So that's why they have to lie, manipulate, and attack. But we have the benefit of the truth being our friend. So I would never, ever tamp down offering loving feedback and critique because I'm afraid of falling into a conservative narrative. But their entire narrative is based on lies and hypocrisy.
Absolutely. I actually was really interested when you started talking about adolescence for a very short period of time. And I would just wonder, like, obviously, I think the effect of cancel culture has been really seen in adolescents with, just how they grew up with social media. They use it, kind of as almost a form of like popularity and whatnot. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about your experience in your vast research and really, I mean, those of us who are adults, I guess we should know better in some way. But this is, when you're a teenager, you're already like an open wound. And then here comes cancel culture. And it's just like, so as a mother of a young daughter, I mean, this scares me so much, but so I just wanted to kind of see if you could elaborate a little bit and just tell me what your thoughts are about that.
Well, when I teach it to young people, they breathe a sigh of relief because based on what they've seen on the internet, they think they're supposed to have every right answer all the time. And they walk around on eggshells for fearing of saying the wrong thing, that they will get called out and canceled by their friends or some kind of mob because they don't know everything they're supposed to know or the right word or the whatever. And so when I tell them that's all the wrong stuff, that you're not supposed to do human rights work that way, they are so relieved. That because I've given them permission to make mistakes. I've given them permission to be real instead of pretending that they know everything. I've given them permission to say, I don't know. Let's find out together, kind of thing. And so they believe too much of what's on the internet about how to be the perfect, never wrong activist, which is just as wrong and as duplicitous as the catfishing everybody's doing over the internet. And so the young people are really, really happy to understand that they should not be punished if they buy a t-shirt for a band that somebody else has called out, kind of thing.
I mean, I identify with what you just said about that, like that. I don't know if I want to say it's like refreshing or it's just kind of like a weight off your shoulders, but I think we all kind of feel that to some extent. And feeling even if somebody has a little bit of empathy or understanding really does open up the door for understanding and conversation. So even just some of the things you said in this conversation really, resonated. I see our chat box is just scrolling by my face. So I'm so excited to take some more questions. Can you talk more about developing racial love in this time of George Floyd and the daily trauma we are witnessing?
Well, I think racial love starts with self-love. I teach a course or I teach within my white supremacy course at Smith, a module called appropriate whiteness, because there's too much bad DEI work taking place, too much bad advice given all, and basically what the reason I'm calling it bad is that I read book after book after book on whiteness studies and the construction of whiteness and how to be an anti-racist and all blah blah, and they all land at the same place that is not a good place for me. And they all, that place is, well, what you need to do is learn to be less white. You know, try to unlive your whiteness. Try to not live your white privilege. You know, and I'm like, well, wait a moment. That's like giving somebody a test that you know they're going to fail. How the hell are you supposed to live to be less white when it's not an identity you gave yourself? It's not a characteristic you have any control over. And the only way you can live being less white is to fake it and lie. Cover yourself with a lot of African clothing and pretend that you're not a white woman, Rachel told us all. I mean, how is that supposed to work? And so that's what so dissatisfies me. And I think that we need to teach white pride and white courage in the fight against white supremacy. Be proud of being white. Repurpose the whiteness in the fight against white supremacy instead of being ashamed of being white. I'm really tired of white people being ashamed of being white. I really am. Because that's the most exhausting thing to deal with, because our human rights organizing spaces become public therapy spaces when they're trying to live out that less whiteness thing.
And the conversation is supposed to be about somebody else, but it turns into the conversation.
Just getting centered on this.
So it is exhausting. I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. Sounds exhausting.
But I think it's based on bad advice, because it's really, there is no, I mean, nobody can tell me be less Black, be less a woman, be less an American. So how the hell is be less white supposed to work?
The sound reasoning right there.
And so racial love starts with racial self-love, owning your whiteness in a way that serves humanity rather than colonizes humanity.
I love that. Could you give an example of what calling in would look like in the workplace when there's an instance of discrimination / transphobia / racism? Specifically, like what, say, how to approach that situation in the workplace?
Well, it depends on what the power differential is, first of all, because as I said in one of my slides, power differentials do matter. And, you know, you don't want to even try calling in or calling out in a place where that could rebound on you, because if that person is not in a space to hear that love and respect that you're offering, it's going to still turn out bad for you, even though you offered it through love and respect. And so there are ways to do calling in the workplace. But again, I call it akin to, I think I need to create a new phrase called identity listening. And that's born out of my experiences as a woman and as a feminist. And that's like, if a woman says something in a meeting, it gets ignored. But if a man turns around and says that same thing in the meeting, because of his identity, it's going to be heard and quite often acted upon. Well, we're all subjected to that identity listening and that identity speaking kind of thing. And so within the workplace, you have to do so many calculations of power and risk. And it's like, just like, I try to tell my college students, don't go home and blow up the Thanksgiving dinner by calling out Uncle Frank when Uncle Frank and your daddy are paying for your college. I mean, really? You think that's a really good strategy? That you're gonna weaponize your knowledge like that and stuff? And so there are ways to do it, but it takes practice, it takes time, and it's not, you know, you just can't tee off on other people and not expect consequences, particularly if they have power over you.
No, that's a good point right there. And then this goes right into this next question. You couldn't have said it up more perfectly. Should we be prepared to lose friends, even if we do attempt to engage them positively? I mean,
well, yeah, you may lose friends, but you may win some too.
Yeah.
Because I call it my Uncle Frank strategy. Like Uncle Frank is the guy that comes to the Thanksgiving dinner party and always blows up the table by saying something racist, sexist, and homophobic. And you're always the one to take Uncle Frank on while everybody else buries their face in the plates and try to ignore what's going on, right? For the sake of peace. But instead, if you turn to Uncle Frank and say, Uncle Frank, I know you're a good man. I know you're such a good man that you would run into a burning building if you could and rescue somebody, and you wouldn't care whether they were gay or whether they were Black or if they were immigrant. So Uncle Frank, help me understand which Uncle Frank I should love. The one that would run into that building or the one with those words coming out of your mouth?
I mean, it's so true. It's such a powerful thing. I've been exercising that recently on Facebook with comments and just trying to like ask people to explain further, because I do think there's also, you talked a lot about social media. I do think that there's, you know, a nuance lost there. We're not talking, there's no intonation. Sometimes you misunderstand people. People don't always use language in, you know, in the ways that you do. So I think there is, I think even before you lash out, that asking, can you elaborate further, or what did you mean by that, is really the right first step before you take that second step, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think you lose friends when you invite them to a fight. You don't lose friends when you invite them to a conversation.
Yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Yeah. And then if you can lose them by a conversation, you need to question how much of a friend they were. Question
your criteria for friends, perhaps.
Exactly.
A reference, this is from a panel, somebody who just wrote in, a reference for you that aligns with your work, Billy Bragg's book, 3 Dimensions of Freedom. The 3 are liberty, equality, and accountability. And that the view of freedom, the view of liberty as the freedom to say whatever you want without consequences, that is not freedom, but impunity. That is a preview of his excellent short book. So that was somebody just trying to give you a little something.
Thank you. I looked that book up. Thank you for the recommendation.
That is interesting. And then we have another question. Where does intersectionality fit into your framework? Can you folks focus on a particular domain without creating contradiction for folks working in other sectors? If so, how? It seems that the broad scope of human rights that you take up tilts us all towards intersectionality rather than a focus on a single domain.
Well, see, you have to understand the dialectic between human rights and intersectionality. Every human being has the same human rights. No one is more human than anybody else. But because of our intersectional identities, we may need something different to protect our human rights. The example that I teach most often is that every child has a right to an education. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm.
Well, would you also agree that a blind child might need her books in Braille?
Mm-hmm.
That's where her intersectional identity identifies her special needs that have to be attended to so that she can get to the same human rights as a sighted child. So if you understand that dialectic between intersectionality as a statement of vulnerabilities and how you have to address those vulnerabilities in order to achieve human rights, you understand how those things work beautifully together.
I haven't heard it put like that so well, and I would like to let that resonate. Do we have any more questions? This has been such a, I can't believe we're already at 7:15. I could listen to this for a while. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. Professor Ross, just so happy that you were able to join us. I read about you in the New York Times, and as just reading that article resonated with me, and kind of like that freedom that you talked about gave me a spark to think, is there a way that I can actually have conversations with people? And I look forward to, in our own community, exploring this further amongst each other and in our own spheres. And I look at this moment as like a ripple moment. And I appreciate you being here to give us that pebble.
Yeah, we are at that inflection moment of whether we're going to be a democracy or an authoritarian failed state. I hope we choose the right one.
I
Thank
do
you
as
for
well.
having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody,
Bye-bye.
for watching and joining us tonight. We appreciate your time, and we hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.